Well, today I'm going to be restoring this sculpture by the artist Michael Malpass. Now, I never got a chance to meet Michael because unfortunately he passed away suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 44, and that was more than 20 years ago. Now, I did get a chance to meet, I actually become good friends with his wife and his children, and in 1999 I curated an exhibition of his work at the Patterson Museum, and ever since then I'll get a call from time to time from collectors asking me if I'll restore a sculpture they have. And it's basically just polishing the surface because this is copper, some of them are bronze, and they tarnish. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'll tell you a little bit about his process because I found it really interesting. Now, I wanted to mention the polish I'm using is Cape Cod metal polishing cloth. And I use this, and I use another product called Never Dull. Now, if I spin the sphere, you can see that I've already almost finished this sign. There's a little more work I need to do. But I thought we should take a closer look and look at some of the individual parts that create this sculpture. Now, a lot of the parts are from plumbing fixtures, the elbows for plumbing, automotive parts, anything copper in this case, because this is a copper sphere. Now, parts like this, he's actually forged, and I'll try to explain how he did that. And I was fortunate enough to see a video of him at work. It's sort of an older VHS video, but it really explains his process well. Well, if you're like me, you look at something like this and think, how did the artist make this? And so fortunately, as I mentioned, I saw a videotape of Michael at work, and he explains that the spheres were made by using a sea buoy. Now, what a sea buoy is, if you've ever seen a steel buoy, it's usually in the bay or the ocean, he would take a sea buoy and cut it in half and then build the sphere from the inside out. So essentially he would build two halves, put them almost together, and then weave in other pieces to create the whole. Once the whole piece was a sphere, then he would fill in with generally a brass brazing rod, or yeah, I guess it's a brass brazing rod. And I'll bring the camera closer and sort of point that out. Now, this is a good example of how the artist would fill the space between the copper with a brass brazing rod. So you can see it right here. You can see it again over here. And it's really throughout the entire sculpture. As I mentioned before, Michael would make these spheres out of plumbing parts, fittings, automotive parts, but he would also forge a lot of the parts. And this is a good example right here. This piece is made from a piece of square stock. This one, you can actually see the square and then it starts to twist off. And obviously, you can see how this is made by the artist. Now, referring to that twisted piece that looked a little like threaded rod, the way Michael would do that is he would take a piece of square stock, say 3/8 or 1/4 inch, and put it in a vise so it was standing straight up. And then heat that piece of material up with an oxygen acetylene torch and connect a vice grip at the top. And as he was heating, simply twist that rod. And you can imagine how that shape would then form in the rod. Then he would take the rod and place it inside the sphere, working from the inside, and forge that into the sculpture. Now you have to imagine, now you take these two halves and you attach them. The outside is going to be very rough and jagged. And it's my assumption that at that point, he would then grind the sculpture with progressively finer grits of grinding discs and sandpaper, and probably filling gaps along the way with the oxygen acetylene torch. To help explain that idea a little bit more, let's pretend that this piece of weather stripping is a piece of metal that we've heated up with the oxygen acetylene torch. Now you can see as we twist the material, that shape begins to appear. Now as the material is hot, you could also forge it into the sculpture. Now I'm going to focus a little on some of the patterns that you often find in Michael's sculptures. Now you can see that you have this round shape here, and over here there's something that looks like a almost like a link to a chain. Where is it? Oh, right here. To make those patterns, one of Michael's main tools was the bandsaw. And he would spend hours at the bandsaw cutting fittings, automotive parts, anything into shapes. And if you imagine cutting a pipe, if you cut it at an angle, you're going to end up with a different shape. So if you can imagine that you've got a somewhat complicated brass fitting, if you were to cut that in half, well, you have two halves now that are completely different than what you started with. So that's kind of what really draws me to Michael's work, is the time investment that he's made in every sculpture, and also the physical investment. I mean, he's just working, and I really appreciate that, and I think it makes it possible to deal with the sculpture on a very human level, which is very different from a lot of the art that's made today. And I'm referring to Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst, where they don't actually even touch their work. But anyway, what I'd like to do now is I'm going to go downstairs. I don't have a metal bandsaw, but I have a wood bandsaw, and I'm going to try to explain how these patterns were made by Michael using the bandsaw. Okay, well, I'm down here in the wood shop now, and this bandsaw is a lot like what Michael had, except with a different blade. This is a blade for cutting wood. Now, what Michael would do is he would take a piece of stock, and there's all kinds of great shapes in industry, like I said, automotive, plumbing, and you would take that, or he would take that a piece of stock, and then just start to cut it on the bandsaw. And I'll show you, just imagine that this piece of molding that I have is brass or copper. And then once all of the shapes were cut, I can imagine that he'd probably spend a good amount of time coming up with a pattern that he felt was appropriate for the sculpture. Okay, well, that's about it. And as you can see, the sculpture shined up really nicely. Now, I always look forward to these projects because I'm a big fan of Michael's work, and this just gives me an opportunity to really look at his work, and you can sort of see some of the decisions that he was making as he was creating the sculpture. Now, if you'd like to see more of Michael's sculpture and pictures of Michael when he was making the sculptures, visit michaelmalpass.com. I'll put a link in the description. That's a really good website, and it's got some great photography in it. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for tuning in.